And we're back. Eric, good to see you again.
Likewise, John. How are you?
I am doing great. I'm looking forward to getting back into agentic process automation. So I know what we're going to talk about. So let me just tee it up for us today. We're going to be talking about agentic knowledge fabric. I'd love you to define that. But before you do, I just want to make sure that people that want to stay with us on this podcast, I want them to know that 4 weeks ago, we did our first thing on agentic process automation. And just last week, we had another session. So this is the ongoing journey into taking a look at many of the components as they evolve to create agentic process automation. So again, knowledge fabric. Let's start by defining it, Eric.
Sure. So I'll try really start with a really simple definition because I know we're going to go into a lot of detail.
Yes, we
So,
are.
so this the agentic knowledge fabric is specifically focused around optimizing the context, the material that we put in the agent or LLM context window. It is about being able to ingest that information from a vast corpus. It's about indexing that information and then serving it to an agent in a token budget aware fashion and making sure we get the right information concepts, policies, so that the agent can actually address queries, requests in an effective and efficient fashion.
Okay, so this reminds me, we have talked about the scarcest resource in AI is the context window. And we have talked about creating the minimum viable context. So anybody that wants to hear about those or see what you've written about those and what we've put together, that's all available in the Substack and in previous episodes. But we're going to focus on that retrieval part so that the agent or LLM can gather that context that they need. And we're also going to talk about how we prepared that knowledge fabric with all of the information that exists in the organization that is relevant to what we're trying to solve for. So that I think is where we're going to start. We're going to talk about how does the agent or the LLM know what context to grab. And do you want to say a little bit about that and some of the retrieval mechanisms and how to think about that?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a bunch of different domains, topics that we're going to talk about during this discussion. So first off, obviously, we've got this vast corpus of information, petabytes of structured, unstructured, multimodal, some voice, perhaps, some transcripts, some video. All that is a corpus of information, petabytes in a large enterprise. The challenge we have is an agent or its LLM only has probably 200,000, maybe a bit more tokens, words roughly, that it can actually use to address a request or a query. So we got to get that petabyte set of information, get the right information in this very tight token budget. So obviously there's a whole bunch of things that need to go in to do that. There's the ingestion process that gathers that information, identifies concepts, the nouns, the facts that are in an organization, but also the policies or decision boundaries that actually determine how a business operates or makes decisions. So the first step is ingesting the corpus and identifying the concepts and the policies. What do we do with it? Well, we store it, obviously, whether it's in a knowledge graph or a vector database or a combination of all of these things, so that we can actually index that information in an appropriate fashion. The last part of it is being able to serve that information so that when an LLM in an agent has a query, it is
Yep.
actually able to retrieve that information from that indexed repository, get the right concepts, nouns, facts, get the right policies and decision boundaries, put that into the context window in a token-aware fashion so that the agent can actually do its work. That end-to-end process is what we call the virtual context manager to serve the minimum viable context. The agentic knowledge fabric is that repository of information, John.
Okay. Now, I've seen a lot of visuals that we put together to try to explain that. If you're following along and you want to see, check out the Substack. There's a great picture that talks about minimum viable context. Okay, so where do we want to start? Do we want to start by talking about the corpus, or do we want to start by talking about the agent or the LLM that's retrieving it?
Well, let's start with the. We've mentioned some of the challenges. So let's talk about the challenge that says I got to. It's not a compression algorithm necessarily, but we got to get a petabyte into this tiny window. But here's the challenges that people have, and why this is not a very simple thing to do. There's I call them knowledge foibles, but these are the challenges that people have today as they try and assemble their understanding of a business and the business process. These are the same type of challenges that we see with agents. So one is the parable of the blind men and the elephant.
Sure.
And effectively different people have different experiences and attribute different meanings to seemingly the same thing. So the parable says, I got this elephant and a number of blind men are trying to figure out what it is. They've not seen an elephant before. One touches the foot and says it's a tree trunk. The other one touches the tail and says it's a snake. The other one touches the trunk and says, you know what, this is actually a vine. So literally the same thing with different meanings. Yes, it's a parable, but we can all understand how things like a customer from a
Yes.
sales perspective is different than a customer from a anti-money laundering or fraud perspective. So
Right.
seemingly the same concepts are actually interpreted different based on context and the experience. The second thing is what we call broken telephone. So this is we're people. One person talks to another one, talks to another one, talks to another. This is normal in an organization. But when somebody starts with a topic, if you think of the child's game where somebody starts with peas, then it goes to bees, knees, cheese, turns into fleas at the end. Ultimately, as we communicate, the meaning loses its coherence. But here's the thing, and why this is so relevant for agents is agents talk natural language like people. And if we don't have consistency and care in the definition of the concepts and the policies, we will have broken telephone happening with
Yeah.
agents. We'll have the blind men and the elephant happening with agents. So the very first thing I would say, John, is we talked about the scale problem going from petabytes to this tiny context window, but there's also the ability to refine concepts and policies in a fashion that is clear, consistent, and coherent. And that's where things like a vocabulary come in play. That's where a taxonomy comes in play. That's where a ontology comes in play. The semantics and being able to attribute semantics is actually one of the core challenges of this, John. Now, this is a library management problem. This is a knowledge management problem. It's a little bit more, but it's all of those things wrapped into
Yeah,
one.
no, and I always think of my sister and Jessica Talisman, who's talks a lot about this stuff, and I love the way she has shared the history of how to think about knowledge management, and especially she has a methodology for defining a vocabulary and working with teams to establish a taxonomy, a way to have a parent-child relationship between concepts and ultimately defining ontologies and including thesauri and other things that she's an expert in. Okay, so I'm not the expert. What it reminds me of, and she's said it out loud before, is when I got into systems integration back in the early days of my career, interoperability was always the goal of these ontologies. And so she reminds us that there are pre-existing ontologies that already exist. And there are tons of them. And so there are tons of well-established vocabularies and taxonomies and ontologies. And so I don't want to misrepresent our knowledge about knowledge management, but we do want to stand on the shoulders of those that have and cite their work and think about some of the first principles that they talk about. So, in doing that, let's be really careful. we talked about two things that we want to separate things into. It's either a concept or a policy. And how are we, or how are you thinking about how we manage those nouns and those concepts and how we relate those?
Yeah, the I think the most common thing, mostly because it's probably the easiest to do, is to focus on concepts. So the nouns, the facts that are in an enterprise. And I think that it's pretty natural for most data people because that's what we more often than not deal with. We deal with the concepts. We keep track of entities. These entities reflect the business. The thing that we don't necessarily emphasize, perhaps enough, some people do. So I don't want to characterize it as a problem everywhere, but the challenges that we see are policies, decision boundaries, if then else, exceptions, overrides. Hate to say it, John, are second class citizens in
Yes.
now. Jessica Talisman would say that they are peers to each other, and I would agree 100%. Strongly recommend her Substack. But here's the thing: is it's much easier to do the concept thing and identify the concept that is the policies. But to do this well, we have to do both.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. And the one term we didn't use that we could is to talk about a knowledge graph and the relationships between those entities or concepts. And I'm being loose in my language, and I know I'm not trying to frustrate anyone. But that those relationships and how that's stored in the form of a knowledge graph, I think that's also part of the solution that everybody's talking.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I would add to that too. When we think of loosely speaking, the Agentic Knowledge Fabric is an index scheme on top of a vast corpus. Obviously, it has provenance and stuff like that. There's a bunch of techniques we can use to store. Well, store is perhaps the wrong word. We can store it in a bunch of different ways. There's a vector database, there's a knowledge graph, et cetera. And there's relational databases or unstructured, databases that store unstructured data. There's a lot of different things available to us, but the key is which one gives us the biggest bang for the buck, and what's the scoring algorithm that we actually use. Knowledge graphs have significant promise. They're probably right now, I would say, the go-to. What I would say though is we still need to think about how we combine multiple ways of actually scoring the data, getting the top most relevant policies and concepts. So perhaps we would combine that with similarity scores from a vector database. There may be other mechanisms that we can actually look at. But what we're finding is one size may not necessarily fit all, but it definitely starts with a knowledge graph. But there may be augmentations around that core concept, but they're definitely a core piece of the puzzle.
Okay, good. And I think you purposefully talked about the storage of this stuff and the indexing of this stuff versus the retrieval. And the retrieval can make it take advantage of many of these techniques, right? So I just want to give people a way to separate into two. Because this is all data people do is talk about how do you store it, how do you index, how do you retrieve it. Those are three separate bodies of knowledge, and they each have techniques that apply. And what we have found since our September 2023 project for naive RAG implementation is that a hybrid approach is the one that everybody's converging on, right? Everybody's realizing that if you need, depending on the problem you're trying to solve, how you combine those methods makes a big difference. And I don't think the purpose is to get into retrieval algorithms or how to do a hybrid retrieval, but maybe that's something we can come back to or talk about another time. We've talked about the corpus, how we organize it, how we sort it out into concepts and policies, and that it needs to be stored. I know we've been doing a lot of work together about prototypes and experiments and some production stuff that you've been doing. Do we want to say more about the technology behind the fabric, or do we want to just let it sit right there for now and come back to it in a future episode?
Maybe just to touch real quickly, it's not necessarily the technology per se, but the word we've used the word provenance maybe once or twice.
Oh gosh, yes. Let's
And I
come
think,
back to it.
yeah, so I think that's crucial. And I think it serves two purposes. One is from a governance perspective. I put this stuff into my Agentic Knowledge Fabric. Why is it in there? And where did it come from? So
That's
that's
right.
that's part one. Here's the most interesting part from the retrieval side, the serving of the content, is effectively then the Agentic Knowledge Fabric is our indexes. It's indexes to the real data, the corpus. And what we need to do is have enough evidence in the provenance. I'll just use it. It's so closely related to provenance that it's probably somewhat similar data. But effectively, if the provenance says this index points to this data and this is why it's the right stuff, with a little bit of augmentation, we could actually use that to retrieve the actual data, because we do need the actual data inside the context window. So we need to use the indexes to go and fetch the real data. So the other piece of the puzzle here is provenance plays a key role. Provenance gets elevated to one of the core pieces of metadata around this. So this agentic knowledge fabric is not only indexing and the technologies that we may use to do that, but it is managing the metadata and the provenance, which is so crucial in this.
Okay. So you've used provenance a few different ways. And I want to suggest that we're not using it in the formal definition of library science. Okay. So, yes, sister, I'm hearing you. Okay. Because she gave me a book called Diplomatics, which was all about library science. And it's just beautiful and brilliant. And it's not what we're able to talk about cogently. So, because when we talk about provenance, I hear you use that word, but in some ways, I feel like it's a pointer. You know, it's, as much as it is anything else, it's an identifier of where to find it. But technically, provenance could be a much broader concept with a lot more interesting aspects to it. One of the things I would like to do, because I've heard it nicely separated, is the difference between lineage and provenance. And what I've heard a lot of, well, what I used to mean when I talked about lineage is I thought about all of the transformations or the where did I get the data from that I used in this step of a process? So there was a lot of implication that this was a data processing pipeline. And so lineage is sort of my old-fashioned way of talking about it, but the more I hear how to think about knowledge management and provenance, I think ultimately we're all going to have to level up and understand and use that term effectively, because I think there's more to it than just a pointer to the source. And it reminds me that in the data management world, and then we used to call it reference data management, country codes, how many country codes are there? And dude, this was a hilarious problem. It's always been a hilarious problem in computing systems because as soon as you're sharing information, what country is it from? Am I allowed to play this media in a different country, right? Remember region codes on DVDs? If anybody remembers what a DVD is. Anyway, I met one of the team members or multiple of the team members who actually put together the codes that described the languages that were used for media. I think she was at HBO. I'd love to interview her sometime. But when they were starting to create digital media, how do you identify the language? Well, you need a reference data list. So I think of that, or I don't know how to think of that. I wouldn't think of that as an ontology per se, but I think of it as uh, governed reference data. Maybe we used to call it master data. I don't know. But it comes from an authoritative source, kind of like an ontology. The American Medical Association vouches for this ontology. Somebody vouches for the language codes on digital media, right? And there's other standards organizations and other industries that think about reference data. So, as a data guy, I'm just saying all of this out loud because I know, as does Eric, that this magical world of representing everything, this corpus of all knowledge, is not what we're talking about solving today. We are merely trying to put it in a system where we can talk about it intelligently and we can understand how to think about it when we're saying, hey, I'm proposing that these are the concepts I'm going to feed to the agent, and these are the policies I can feed to the agent. And so, thanks for letting me ramble on there, Eric.
No, no,
Okay.
no
Because
worries.
I
No
had to
worries.
get a lot of that out for my people out there.
Good to get it out. Well, I want to come back to kind of one of the next challenges that I
Sure.
think people that we've seen anyway. I'm sure other people will have also. Is the obvious question I think is where does all this data come from? Yes, it's in the enterprise, but what type of data should we actually look for? So the most obvious, simplest ones, not to trivialize this in any way, but your databases. Uh, your data sources have, for the most part, structured data. The interesting thing about it, I may have the numbers wrong, but I would venture to guess that the vast majority of data is not structured, is not in databases, but is in file systems, video, audio, all sorts of other formats. The other piece I would say is maybe not the vast amount of data, but probably some of the most important data is locked in experts' heads. That tacit knowledge that is not written down anywhere, and this is probably where you're going to find a lot of your policies, your exceptions, your overrides. But there's a huge set of sources out there that people need to think about. So if you need to get tacit knowledge, let's interview the experts. Let's capture the transcripts. Let's ingest that data, process it, put it into the Agentic Knowledge Fabric. What about standard operating procedures? They have not only the concepts, but the policies that, if you can find them, the policies that govern how the business should run. What about regulations, regulatory documents, compliance documents? They say what must happen or what should happen or what should not ever happen. These are huge, incredible resources that have mountains of information around the policies that run the business. Now there's other stuff, the emails, Slack, SharePoint. We're working with one client. SharePoint Google Drive contains tons of information, and we have to go find a Jira, GitHub for source code and tickets, ServiceNow. So there's a huge amount of data. So I don't want to, this is not a trivial exercise by any stretch. And we don't recommend at all to swallow the whale or take a bite of the whale. What you need to do is pick where you want to focus your attention, and start there, because this is a relatively new field in the grand scheme of things. There are definitely some experts that you should be relying on if you can find them, but the information is literally lying there. It's not so easy to pick up and consume, but it is out there, and we need to kind of expand our reach, if you will, a little bit.
Yes. Okay, good. So we've talked about the variety of types of data, where we find it, where different systems. We've even I think on one podcast we referred to business records. So yeah, there is a ton of enter we used to call it I used to run a practice called enterprise content and information management. I didn't know half of what we were supposed to do. I was only good at one half. But anyway, so let's move on from this definition of the corpus. We say that it needs to be indexed. We say that it needs to be distilled into something that represents a minimum viable context for an agent. Well, how does the agent use that information? How do they access that information? Is this MCP servers and function calls, or teach us how to think about how LLMs or agents should be thinking about accessing this fabric?
Yeah, I think there's probably three techniques. If you are writing with Crew AI, for example, or LangChain, both wonderful products out there, you have access to function calls. So you could write the retrieval mechanism in functions, Python function calls, for example, or classes. So that's one way to do it. The second way is to use MCP. So MCP will allow you to position that agentic knowledge fabric as a tool that it accesses. It's part of the external environment. Use MCP to protocols to actually go and get that information. The one that we see gaining a lot of traction is skills. And skills originated out of Anthropic. They're on a tear right now. They have some fantastic technology, but skills are being adopted rather by Google, OpenAI, and a variety of others. So I don't know if I call them an industry standard, but definitely a de facto standard. But the concept is actually relatively simple. A skill.md is just a markdown file. It happens to be structured in a way that makes it easy for an LLM to actually consume and understand, but it is still a markdown file. And you do have some flexibility. That markdown file may give instructions on what decisions to make, how to go and access some of that information. There may even be code fragments in it. So what an LLM would do that can consume these skills is it looks at the request, looks at the inventory, the universe of skills that are available, and it would find the ones that are most relevant, and it would then put those skills into the context window, and then the LLM would be able to consume those skills and then execute the code fragments, or it would know enough to go and search the internet or whatever the case may be. So skills we actually see as probably the way that is probably positioned best for the future today, John, to actually build this minimum viable context.
Okay, so I really want to come back to those three just and simplify what you said. So you could do a function call. Hey, go get me all the stuff related to this, right? But that's hard to manage because it could change every time, But a function call is one way to get context. The other is through MCP, Model Context Protocol. You define tools that can extract data in the form that's relevant, that the tool supports, and it returns that. And then finally, skills, which are currently implemented as markdown files and provide more flexibility in how you retrieve that data. But how does a skill interface with the agentic fabric? Is there a server, like a skill server somewhere, or teach us how to think about it at just the highest level without.
Yeah, sure. Now, if you're looking at like Claude Code and some of the others, there's skills are retained in two places. The primary one that everybody's probably most comfortable is on your local machine in a directory that Claude Code or OpenAI can access. You can also upload your skills, the skill markdown files, to a service that Anthropic has or that OpenAI has, and then they can be referenced using their respective API calls. So what that does is it registers the name of the skill um, to your own workspace, accessible to you with based on your key, and then it would be able to retrieve this skill from that repository. So two different ways. The most common one is it's in your local directory.
And I think this is what I love about AI because I was working with a customer today and we were talking about the difference between MCP and tools. And we didn't talk about skills, but I'm glad we didn't because the industry is moving so fast that they're not cleaning up or not the bad ideas, but the earlier generation ideas. And, MCP servers, what has it been? Just a year or so, maybe at best. And we're already talking about skills. And if I heard you correctly, you said just like there could be an MCP server marketplace, there could be a skills marketplace. And just like we've talked about those marketplaces, there could be an agent marketplace. So if anybody's listening and trying to figure out or feels that this is complicated, sure, it obviously is. And the purpose of what we're doing here in the podcast is to keep you up to date on the current thinking of how to think about, in this case, this agentic knowledge fabric. Today, it's about skills, markdown files, and marketplaces. I just want to say one thing about markdown files because it's such a funny thing. Engineers, software engineers, treat them as if they're a first class piece of information. Nobody else does. Right? It's only a software engineer that thinks a markdown file is a first class repository. And that's okay because I think technology has to change. And I think we're witnessing it. And we're still in a file based world, which is so hilarious. Uh, but under the covers, everything's just a file. But still, it feels like we haven't reached the level of sophistication equal to the power of the LLM.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to kind of bring this back to agentic process automation. So, if these skills, just focus on skills for a second, because again, they are the up and coming capability. But if these skills are in your local file system on your computer, how would this Claude and its local file system on your computer fit into an enterprise? There's a huge mismatch in
Yeah.
capability, right? If you're working with Claude today, I call them personal agents. They're fantastic, by the way. I use them every day. They're personal agents. They work under my own ID and my own workspace, accessing my own repo on my own local machine. And they have access to any resources I give them, but they're ultimately my resources. In an enterprise, agents typically are implemented as service accounts. And those service accounts have stable, persistent IDs, and they would have roles and permissions that are associated with those. That is a different world than having my local file system having skills. So there's a bunch of different ways you need to handle it, but typically what we see is if you're going to use Claude as a node, an agent in Claude Code or Claude Cowork, if you're using them as nodes in the agentic process, then what you need to do is set them up as service accounts, which does mean if you're using the standard APIs out of the box, you're going to have to register those with OpenAI registry or Anthropic's registry. So you do need to start to make some choices. But to your point, we foresee there's going to be some common open registries that will allow this to work perhaps a little bit more seamlessly. So there's still some work that needs to be done to allow them to fit into the agentic process automation that we actually see as the future, John.
Yeah. Okay. And I'll just say it out loud. It sounds like another area for role based access control and attribute based access control. Because as we said when we were talking about know your agent, that that treating an agent as a service account with root access, and that those aren't the same thing. But a service account doesn't have to have root access. But a lot of software development in the history of the world assumes that you have root access, which means you've got access to anything on your system. That is a non starter in the enterprise. And
Absolutely. Absolutely.
so there has to be a tie between the agent identifier and the skills it's allowed to use at the point of time and when it's acting on behalf of a human, and the delegation of that authority uh, has all been technically solved, but has never been technically solved for agents. And
Yeah. Well, the word you use, the phrase you use, "standing on the shoulders of giants," it couldn't be more appropriate. The data folks have figured role-based access control out. They figured it out long ago. And while it may not be perfect or implemented perfect, they have a view to how to make this work. We need to learn from folks that have done this before. So the good news is there's places that we can look, some stones that we can overturn to actually see the right way to do some of these things.
okay, so it feels like we've drained the topic of agentic knowledge fabric. What should we talk about next time, or is there any summation you want to do before we talk about next week? Thoughts about follow up episodes?
I think we were pretty good on this one
Okay.
here. So let's talk about some of the things that people should look forward to. So we've talked about agentic process automation. We've talked about the agentic knowledge fabric. How do we actually go about designing these processes? In the old world, I would have to define a static flow. I'd have to look at do the happy path, and then I'd spend 90% of my time figuring out the exception paths. Well, agents may offer an opportunity to streamline that work. So I think process design is one. If agents are inside the process, and the best analogy which we've talked about before is if you want to think about how an agent works, think about in a process. How does a person work in a process? Well, the person is an employee, and there's ways to actually onboard employees to measure their performance and improve their performance. The whole idea around HR or human resource management, maybe there's agent resource management that we
Sure.
need to think about. So not that I
Yeah.
want to coin a phrase, but that's something we should think about.
Yep.
This does, focus on thinking about the broader agent life cycle. So I've touched on pieces of the puzzle, but I think that's probably a few things, John, that are going to occupy us for at least the next few episodes.
I love it. And I saw a post this week referring to one of the co-authors of Team Topologies, talking about cognitive load and teams and how that applies to agents. So, dude, we have got a rich set of next few episodes. Love it. Stay tuned, everybody. Like and subscribe. We'll see you next week. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
John. Take
Cheers.
care.